Hello and welcome to lesson 56 of the Learning Guitar series. In this particular lesson we're going to discuss diminished scale. We're going to continue and take it from where we left off. We left off the last lesson, and we're going to look at some of the implications that we can derive from our understanding of diminished in terms of harmony and theory. So we can actually find out how we can use it, not only with diminished chords. Before we even start, I would like to thank the patrons which are supporting this project, and the people who are following and supporting this idea of mine on the YouTube channel. So thank you very much for that. So let's dig into it straight away. Last lesson we looked at the diminished scale from the perspective of a scale that you would use over a diminished chord. And we look at the intervals that the scale generates, and we looked at something that we call whole half type of diminished scale. Just to quickly recap, let's look on the diagram. What does that mean? I'm doing this in A flat, so I have a root note here. And we said, okay, if I have like a tone, then half a tone, then a tone, then half a tone, then a tone, half a tone, a tone, half a tone. Here is my diminished scale. In this case, A flat diminished, and this would work beautifully on a diminished type of chord. Of course, here there is like, a semitone again, and I can work it backwards, obviously, if I wanted to use all the strings. And we say, okay, this is A flat, and it works on A flat half diminished, but we also said this is a symmetrical scale, which means that even if I change the root note in tone and halves, so let's do it actually. Let's change this into the root note. Don't forget the intervals, okay? 1, 2, flat 3, 4, flat 5, sharp 5, 6, major 7. If I make that the root note, the interval are still 1, 2, flat 3, 4, flat 5, sharp 5, 6, and then you have a 7. So we learned that the diminished scale is what we call the symmetrical scale, where it stays the same, and it can take 4 names, and we move it in tones and halves. So this is not only A flat diminished, is also B diminished, is also D diminished, and is also F diminished. I hope that's clear so far. In this case, instead, this week, we're going to look at something that we call half-whole diminished scale. Actually, it's much easier than you think. Basically, the question is, okay, I'm considering this the root note in this contest. I consider this root note, this as a potential root note, this as a potential root note, this as a potential root note, and I'm back. What about if I consider this note the root note? What happens to the intervals? And that's the important part, okay? That's what I want you to pay attention to. Okay, let's consider this now. This hasn't changed, okay? As you can see, the notes, where you will put your fingers on the guitar, is not really changed. But now as an interval, I have 1, flat 2, flat 3, major third, flat 5, 5, 6, flat 7, okay? And what I want you to pay particular attention to is the fact that now I have, in my scale, I have 1, 3, 5, flat 7, which is basically a dominant 7 chord. In other words, 1, flat 7, 3, 5. This is G7 in this case. Not only you have G7 in there, again, you're still preserving the properties of a diminished scale, which means, it's moving symmetrically in tones and half. This, as you can see, is also B flat 7. And this is D flat 7. These are all intervals present. And this is E7. Now, why is this important? Well, the implication of the fact that now I'm still using the same scale. Please don't get confused. That's the part where people sometimes get confused. I'm still using, let's say, A flat diminished. Okay? So I'm using this. But all I'm doing is, okay, instead of thinking of this as the root note of this scale, I'm going to think of this as the root note of the scale. Finger-wise, it's going to look exactly the same. But in terms of chord, of harmony, what I'm thinking of is... And this is a G7 with a flat 9. Okay, so the A flat, as a matter of fact, becomes an alteration for G7. Let's go back to the diagram. I wanted to see, when you do see it even better. Let me write it down. Instead of writing it this way, instead of writing it horizontally, let's write everything vertically for a second. So let's delete all that. Let's delete all that. Again, I'm going to write A flat, my root note. So what we did last week. Last lesson, obviously. And, okay, here is my diminished scale, and this particular scale obviously works over diminished type of chord. Okay? This is what I got. And because from the distance from the root is a tone, and then half tone, and then is a tone, half tone, tone, we call this whole half, or tone, semitone, whatever you prefer. I'm gonna write it here just so that you know. We call that a tone. Whole half. Okay, and we know that this, because of the symmetry that you have going on, this would work on A flat diminished, but is the same as saying, okay, it's also B diminished, and it's also E flat diminished, and is also, D diminished. That's D. And is also F diminished. Okay? Now, all that's happening here is I'm still going to write the same exact scale. Okay? As you can see, nothing is changing. That's the beauty of harmony in theory. We can manipulate things. So, as you can see, it's the same exact scale. But this time, instead of having the root note here, I'm going to place the root note here. And as you can see, the intervals change. Here is my G7 chord. And if you think in terms of, diminished, full diminished, this, which is the diminished chord, okay, you can see it here. Okay, even if I don't play the root, what you have is a dominant 7, so 3, 5, 7, with a flat 9. This note, of course, like right now, is written as a flat 2, so it's a dominant 7 with an alteration. And we call this all diminished. Okay? Because in this case, first you have an semitone, then you have a tone, then you have a semitone. Think in terms of where the root is, okay? And of course, as I said, this particular scale, now we can apply it to dominant 7 chords because they are in there. So this goes over G7. And of course, you still have the symmetry where this scale kind of moves in tones and half, like we discussed in the previous lesson. So this is not only G7. I mean, it can be applied to G7, but can also be applied equally with the same intervals, nothing is changing, if we apply it to B flat. And in fact, this 1, 3, 5, flat 7, this is B flat 7. Does that make sense? And let's move the root note again. If I put the root note in D flat, let's make this the root note. And again, 1, 3, 5, flat 7. And this is D flat. Let's change it again. Again, we're moving it in tones and half. So now it ends up being E. This note is E. Let me make the root, this the root note. And suddenly you have 1, 3, 5, flat 7. So this entire scale, just this scale, can apply to the following chords. B flat 7, a tone and a half up from B flat 7 is D flat 7, and a tone and a half up from D flat 7 is E7. Of course, what you're looking at, if you want it to be very specific in terms of the chord you're generating, is a B flat, G flat 7 flat 9, B flat 7 flat 9. But if you think of it in terms of, okay, what's happening to my dominant 7 chord when I'm using the scale over it? So let's look at the interval I'm generating. So I can think of it in terms of chord plus embellishments of alterations. How do we think of that? Well, we know that for a dominant 7 chord, let me make this, I'll put it back as in the key of G, so might help your understanding. Okay, so this is G diminished, the half old type of, and I'm gonna highlight the chord. So that's G7, 1, 3, 5, flat 7. If you wanted to play the big chord, that's what you're looking at, okay? If you wanted to play with a barré, okay? Now, from the major modes, we know that the scale that will go with this dominant 7 chord in theory is Mixolydian. So Mixolydian has the following interval. I'm going to write it here so we can compare it. Mixolydian is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7. Okay, that's a Mixolydian scale. Now let's see what happens when I superimpose instead of this interval over the G7 chord, and let's look at simply the differences. Okay, diminished is the half all. Let's actually write it this way, so you know, abbreviations. I have a flat 2. You can think of it as a flat 9, okay? Because so that when you think in terms of chords, you can think, okay, it's a G7 flat 9. It's rare that you'll find it as a G7 flat 2. But in terms of what we are alterating, okay, there is a flat 2. There is also a flat 3. And of course, like, you know, we know the flat 3 from minor chords, but at the same time, in this context, we're thinking of it as an alteration. So we're actually thinking of it as, compared to Mixolydian, as, where is my sharp symbol here? We think of it as a sharp 9. So again, this is more about, okay, I have a G7 sharp 9 or a G7 flat 9. I'm basically alterating my G7 by using this scale. So in terms of, if I'm starting to recap in terms of alterations, so okay, I have a flat 9 and I have a sharp 9. After that, I have a 3, fair enough, that's a 3 in common. I don't have a 4 in this case. I don't have a 5 either. I mean, like I have it later on, but I have a flat 5, and that's another alteration compared to Mixolydian. Then I have the 5th, the 6th, so the 13. It's in common between the two, and then I have a flat 7. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 notes. So as you can see, compared to Mixolydian, when I apply this scale over a G7 chord, Mixolydian obviously is going to sound kind of pertinent and proper. And instead, if I use half-fold diminished instead, not only it applies to a dominant 7 chord, but it also is adding some alterations, some interesting sounds. Harmonically speaking, what you're looking at is, for example, G7 flat 9 or G7 sharp 9. And we know that there is also there is also a flat 5 in there. G7 flat 5. Let me I'm going to look at G7 so you can hear how we go from mixolydian to diminished and what's the difference in sound. Here is mixolydian. See, they both sound cool, you know. It's just a different sound. Like I said from the very beginning of this learning experience, it's vocabulary. You know, nothing wrong with mixolydian. You don't necessarily have to complicate your music, your language. But it's good to have an extra word for those contexts where you might like it. Let's take, for example, I'm going to give you a few examples, like a dominant chord resolving into one chord. Since we are using G7, if you remember our lessons, I think 16, a bit of harmony and theory there. We know if G7 is chord number 5, chord number 1 is going to be C major. So I'm just going to loop attention, G7, resolving it into resolution. First, I'm going to use mixolydian, and at the end of the day, G mixolydian and C Ionian are the same notes. So it's the harmony which is actually dictating when it's going to sound mixolydian and when it's going to sound Ionian. And if I use the arpeggio note for G7 for C major, you're actually going to hear, so-called chord tones. And after that, instead, I'm going to apply diminished when G7 is on, and move back to C Ionian, so G mixolydian, when the C major is on. So you can hear the difference of how the language changes, the mood changes. Okay. And now we're using diminished. And I'm sure you can hear the difference, right? There's a different. You have another word. You're learning another word you can use, and of course, you can use the arpeggios too. It goes by without saying. The last question you want to ask yourself about how to, incorporate this into your playing is, let's say a dominant 7 chord comes on a chart. Let's say it's G7. Am I going to think A flat diminished, so the whole half? So am I going to think over it? So in other words, am I going to think the harmonically a semitone above compared to the chord? So basically I'm thinking of the scale the same way we thought of it in the previous lesson. I'll show you visually in case I'm not being clear enough. Am I going to think of this scale? Okay, am I going to think the chord is G7, and as you can see it's here. Okay, 1, 2, 3, and 4. This is G7. Okay, but when this comes, am I going to think A flat diminished? Or am I going to think, and so I'm thinking of the whole half type of diminished? Or am I going to think the half whole and literally think it, okay, it's G7 diminished, but the whole half, the half whole type? Is there a correct answer to this? Not as such. In terms of scale, I tend to think a semitone above. Okay, so if it's E7, I think F diminished. And the reason I tend to think that is because I tend to think of this chord in my head. I'll show it to you. So this is G7, and what I'm thinking of is this chord, even though the root note is not going to be there. So it's 3, flat 7, 5, flat 2, okay? So it's basically G7 flat 9. But at the same time, when it comes to chord playing, I'm very aware that harmonically what I'm thinking is G7 sharp 9, or G7 flat 9, or G7 flat 5, or a simple G7 like 1, 3, 5, 7. So, let's say, is there a correct answer to how you want to approach this in terms of muscle memory, photographic memory? Different players might think of this differently, and as I said, I don't think there is a right or wrong answer. Personally, I tend to think a semitone above, so from the dominant 7 chord in question. So G7, A flat diminished, the whole half. But if you think of the scale, and this actually kind of links me to the PDF that I create in terms of exercises that you can look at. So there were already exercises in the part 1, which I posted 3 weeks ago, and there is more to come with this particular lesson. One thing about the diminished scale, sorry, of course, which is interesting compared to other scales we studied so far, is the fact that it's symmetrical. And in fact, we looked at in the previous lesson how not only we can learn it vertically, and of course we move the same finger pattern in tone and halves. So we were doing this kind of stuff, and so forth and so on. And then I could do the same thing at tone and half up from it, and then I could do. But the finger pattern of scale, it would be four areas of the neck. But we also saw that it moves very symmetrically when it goes diagonally. So if you look at the finger pattern itself, you have, say, 3 first finger, second finger, then you skip a tone, third finger, fourth finger, and then you basically move it diagonally and you do exactly the same thing again. Except in the case of the B string, just because of the tuning. So in other words, your starting point for that particular sequence is there is a jump here because of the tuning, and then you're back to normal. Which actually begs the question, a little bit of a detour. If the guitar was tuned in fourths as opposed to the way we tune it, this would have literally been like that, okay? Which is, I looked into a while ago, actually. I can tune the guitar in fourths, although it kind of throws away my photographic memory. But it's interesting from the point of view, like for those of you who are doing fourth tuning, makes it even more symmetrical, the way the fretboard is organized. Anyway, let's go back to our diagonal playing. And that is common because it's comfortable, especially in a moment like now when we're looking at exercises like we did literally from lesson 1, where we are analyzing the scale and we're looking at all the intervals that we can practice within it. So here we're thinking of this as a half all, and of course this particular scale now not only applies to A flat, B diminished, D diminished, and F diminished, like I was doing in the last lesson, but it also applies to G7, B flat 7, D flat 7, and E7. Here is the vertical shape, and of course you can move it symmetrically. It is the diagonal shape. From this point onward, what you're looking at is intervals of seconds, minor third intervals, and it's all diagonal, okay? As you can see, it starts at fret 3, ends up at fret 13, and of course backwards. This is third, starting from the first note, then the second note, etc., etc. This is the reversed version. As always, I mean, like if you started from lesson 1 in my lessons, you know exactly what I mean. This is the alternate A version. This is the alternate B. This is just intervals of minor thirds. This will need an explanation. I'll give it to you in a second. So it's major third and fourths alternated, okay, within the same scale. And after that, we have flat fives, interval, diagonal, as usual, reversed. And for this lesson, I stopped at flat 5 intervals because that's enough work, I think, for the next 3 weeks. And then I'm going to create an extra lesson that deals with the rest of the intervals, maybe until the octave, if it makes sense. Why it's, you have, say when we did major modes, let's say we did 30 intervals, didn't particularly, separate the fact that when you do thirds, actually some of the intervals are minor thirds, some of the intervals are major thirds. I'll give you an example. This is just a normal G Ionian. And if I play an interval of thirds, what I get starting from this is a minor third, this is a major third, minor third, minor third. But we just thought of that exercise just like a minor, thirds, intervals. Same thing happened with the fifths. Sometimes there was a flat 5 in there. In this case, I actually consciously pointed out, okay, here we're doing minor thirds, and it's literally only minor thirds. And this is, again, part of what's interesting about diminished. So if I think of now the diminished scale, this is a minor third interval. This is a minor third. This is a minor third. This is a minor third. And also, again, the reason we're doing diagonally, again, is the symmetry. Have a look at the finger pattern. 1, 4, then I'm moving every finger semitone up, 1, 4. Now I have this pattern. Okay? Now that I move to the next string, it's exactly the same pattern. Except now here, where it's not going to be this pattern because of the tuning of the B string, but rather this. And now you're back to the same pattern. That's why we're starting as opposed to play them vertically at the moment, where the fingering would change all the time. I wanted you to see the symmetry happening, even on so many levels. In this case, intervals, where the finger pattern stays the same and makes it very, very interesting. You see what I mean? And on and on. And these are all flat 3 intervals. Literally, there is no major 3 in there. So why, at some point, then I actually wrote it as, okay, now the next exercise is a major 3 and alternated with fourths. Because when you look at the scale, if you look at the scale from this perspective, as you can see, there is a minor 3 interval in there, but there is also major 3, okay? And I can develop both. So here is my minor 3 interval if I go 1, flat 3, then flat 2, major 3, flat 3, flat 5, 3, 6, and these are all minor third intervals that I'm playing. But I can also play 1, 3, which is a major 3, and then the second interval would be flat 2, flat 5, and this is a fourth. And then this flat 3, 5 is again a major 3, and then 3, 6 is again a fourth. What I'm going to is that when you practice major third and fourths, actually what you get is another form of symmetry where you have always a major third interval followed by a fourth, followed by a major three interval, followed by a fourth, all the way. I'll show you. So here is a major three, fourth, major three, fourth, major three, and again the fingering stays the same too. And so forth and so on. That's what makes this very interesting. That's why we're studying intervals this way. As you move forward from the thirds and fourths alternating, then you have flat five intervals, and literally it's all flat five intervals. There is no a fifth like happening, okay? And you have this kind of. And again, it's the fingering is always the same as you move across the strings because of the symmetrical nature of the scale, except when you move in between the G string and the B string because of the tuning. So you end up with this kind of thing. Here is your flat five interval. It's not this, but this. And then in between the B string and the E string, you're back to the way we tune the guitar in fourths, right? I hope this is clear, and I hope you understand why in the study of intervals we are starting, before we look at it eventually vertically. The thing with vertically, you will, if you try, you'll notice that some of the fingerings, once you get to flat five intervals or sometimes fourth intervals, you end up with things like this for the sake of playing. And again, nothing wrong with that. It's worth experimenting. At the same time, it's great if we can take advantage of the symmetry that the diminished scale grants us. So just for the sake of sound, I'm going to play like a G7. And this is the way you actually want to practice. So you have some degree of ear training, and you can use any of the backing tracks. If you're on Advanced Patreon, you can use any of the backing tracks that are available on Patreon. You can do this on any dominant 7 chord, okay? And again, because I'm using 4 notes on each string, I'm thinking now, okay, this is G diminished, half, whole, half, so semitone, tone, semitone, tone, semitone, tone. And if I just play the scale, and of course this helps you kind of getting your ear training going. And the same thing you can do with the intervals, no? And of course there's the alternated versions and all the kind of stuff. As I said, I don't want to waste your time. I know these lessons are not exactly entertaining, and they don't want to be entertaining anyway. It's like, I know YouTube is, that's what, I don't have 10 million followers because this is not entertaining, but I'm supposed to eventually like inspire you into learning something, okay? So if it's boring, I do apologize, but it is what it is. Anyway, I hope this is clear. We're going to have one more lessons on diminished. Again, we're going to look at other applications. More importantly, we're going to finish all the intervals. And again, the symmetry thing, when we do arpeggios within it, again, it's going to be very, very interesting and add more words to your vocabulary. Once again, I would like to thank the patrons who are supporting this project. It's very important, and I hope more of you will do that, so that, it's an effort, but it's a liberal love, like as they say. Enjoy practicing, and of course, as always, if you have any question, just feel free to drop a comment on YouTube or send me a message. It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Bye.